Thank you all for coming. I want to thank all the participants for participating and coming. I want to put this is a discussion about, it's going to focus, I think, mostly on immigration policy, and I want to put it into a larger context. The immigration issues that people talk about fall into two camps. One is what to do about those who are here, undocumented, and the issue of a path to citizenship and all that. And the other issue is, those issues are usually talked about don't break up the families, about what the contributions of immigrants can make to our country, to issues of democracy, about not having second-class citizen or second-class status, and many other issues, all of which are, and giving opportunity to the dreamers, et cetera. Those are all important issues. Another part of the debate is about guest workers. How many? How do we decide? What are the rules and regulations that govern them? But I want to bring this discussion to the larger question about wages in America, which is going to be one of the main topics of discussion during the presidential debate. We have, I'm really happy to report that both the Republican and Democratic candidates are talking about wages and what we can do about them. That's not something that was true a few years ago. I mean, 4 years ago, we were barely talking about inequality until Occupy Wall Street showed up. That conversation about inequality didn't really get to wages, even when the president started talking about the issue. It eventually moved that way, I think, because of the Fight for 15, the fast food workers, Walmart workers, and it actually became bipartisan when the Republicans noticed the outcome of the last election. Two things. One, the unemployment rate had gone down quite a lot, so they couldn't attack Obama about jobs as readily as they used to. But they also noted that people were concerned about growing incomes and especially about wages. So they started talking about wages, which is not actually a very traditional Republican issue. Here we are. We have at EPI, we have formulated an agenda for how to raise wages called Raising America's Pay, and I think it's been distributed to everybody. One of those items has to do with immigration, which is where I want to make the connection. We are saying that providing a path to citizenship, not just authorization, providing a path to citizenship, is a critical part of raising wages in America. We have 5% of the workforce that are unauthorized, undocumented. We know that people in that situation don't have a lot of legal rights. They've actually been blocked by being covered by various laws, and they have obviously the threat of deportation and all of that. They are vulnerable to exploitation, and they are exploited, which is kind of a natural law of capitalism. If you are vulnerable to exploitation, you will be. That's the way employers and markets work. So the papers today provide some insight about that. And I want to point that out because a lot of the discussion in the papers has to do with comparing what happens to temporary workers or people with green cards versus unauthorized workers, or temporary status versus unauthorized workers. I want to focus on what having legal rights and especially citizenship has on wages, which is part of the larger topic. Lauren's paper makes a great contribution to this from a unique data set of Mexican immigrants, which is not all immigrants, but that's a pretty important segment of the immigrant population. Buried in table 3 on the fourth column is an estimate that I can read that not everybody can read, but it says that people with green cards, LPRs in the terminology of the paper, which just doesn't come naturally to me. But make 13% more than those who are unauthorized, okay? That's an important finding. Now, that doesn't show what the effect of citizenship is, because citizenship actually, by other studies, shows an even greater wage effect. So there's a wage advantage to being a citizen, being a naturalized citizen, versus having a green card. Our Manuel Pastor, a longtime collaborator at EPI and a member of the board, has done research that on some special data in California, where he argues that the effect of citizenship is far larger than the effect actually of just having a green card. So that would mean the 13% differential could be, could be twice as large for citizenship. Her data doesn't have the identification of citizenship to be able to make that estimate. Tom Hertz's work in agriculture has the disadvantage of being for one sector, but it has a tremendous advantage of having actual data on exactly people's legal status and standing. And he does show a wage effect of having a green card, and shows that being a citizen has a bigger effect than having a green card. Both effects are relatively modest, but that may be because of the special nature of you're just capturing people within a sector. But it does sort of confirm the idea that there is something different about citizenship for just having legal status. So I just want to then note from this that the implication should be that those people who are arguing for comprehensive immigration reform and those people who are arguing for better wages in America should recognize and articulate that immigration reform it can make a great contribution to better wages in America, because having 5% of the workforce standing outside of our labor standards can't be good for those workers, and it can't be good for the workers in similar fields of work. We don't have specific estimates, which is a frontier of social science that and perhaps Lauren can turn to. But how do we estimate what the spillover effect is of undocumented status, the wage penalty, and the wages of other people? The undocumented workers are concentrated in particular occupations and in particular regions, and that's something that we hope to explore in the future. But I just want to illuminate those issues that come from these papers. Thank the authors for their work, and now we can have the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. So since we started a little bit late, I'll just give a very brief introduction of Lauren Apgar. She is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Indiana, or Indiana University, sorry, in the Department of Sociology, and she's almost done, right? Knock on wood. So her research interests center in the fields of immigration, stratification, and political sociology, and work. And as Larry alluded to, she's actually done some groundbreaking research using the Mexican Migration Project data set. So with that, Lauren, please go ahead and put up your presentation.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's great to be here today. Thank you for your interest in the guest worker experience. So as you may know, temporary foreign worker programs allow migrants to enter the U.S. workforce for a designated period of time, after which the workers return to their home countries. And legislators view the program as a way to decrease unauthorized migration, especially that from Mexico. So the idea behind the program, or one of the ideas, is that Mexicans aspiring to work in the U.S. would obtain a guest worker visa instead of crossing the border to look for work without authorization. However, I argue that if guest worker programs are really going to be a viable alternative to unauthorized migration, they should really reduce the risks that they encounter in the workforce. To that end, I wanted to examine guest workers' work experiences. So my research question is, how do temporary workers' economic outcomes, such as their hourly wages, compare to those of legal permanent residents and unauthorized workers? So just briefly, I'd like to give some background on the legal rights of temporary workers. Under the guest worker program, Mexicans commonly enter on H-2A visas for agricultural work and H-2B visas for low-skill or seasonal work. All H-2 workers are legally authorized to work in the U.S. for 1 year and up to 3 in jobs not filled by Americans. And all H-2 workers' admission to the U.S. is based on a visa that's tied to their employer. Therefore, they cannot change employers or jobs while working in the U.S. And then H-2 workers must be paid at or above the average hourly wage in the occupation of their employment. So these workers are distinct from LPRs, or legal permanent residents, because LPRs have most of the same rights as native-born citizens in terms of employment. They can negotiate with their employer, they can change jobs. And then the temporary workers are also distinct from unauthorized immigrants, especially because unauthorized workers face deportation if their presence is detected by immigration officials. So from the rights given to these different groups, we might think that there is some kind of hierarchy. So immigrants with limited rights might have lower wages than those with more rights. And there has been research showing that LPRs earn more than unauthorized workers because they have rights unauthorized workers do not. So we might think that since temporary workers' rights kind of fall in between these two groups, their economic outcomes might fall in the middle. However, one study that actually compared the work experiences of unauthorized workers with temporary workers found that both groups actually suffered similar workplace abuses, such as not receiving pay for all of their work. So that was a study done in the forestry industry. And it really kind of suggests that maybe temporary workers and unauthorized workers have similar labor market experiences. So the question really remains, how do the wages of these two groups compare? So I used the Mexican Migration Project data to answer this question. And this data is a really unique data set. It's a random sample of heads of households from various communities in Mexico. And so here's a picture of the various communities where the data have been collected. And it's been collected yearly since 1987. Because they survey household heads, it's usually mostly men who have completed the survey. And they ask household heads if they had any migration experience in the U.S. And if so, they collect detailed information on their most recent migration trip. So the data have experiences in the U.S. from 1987 to 2011. And then the MMP measures hourly wage. So it asks the workers the amount they earned per hour in their most recent job on their most recent trip to the U.S. And legal status was determined through the documents that they reported they used on their most recent trip, or the lack thereof. So I performed OLS regression, which allows us to see the differences in wages between the legal status groups, holding other characteristics at similar levels. So I'm considering things such as years of education, English language proficiency, the occupation sector, and the year of migration. So my findings, turning to results. So as Larry mentioned, my results replicate other researchers' findings that unauthorized workers' wages were lower than LPR's wages. And then when we look at temporary workers, I find that temporary workers' wages and unauthorized workers' wages were about the same. There was like a 1% difference that was not significant. And then so compared to LPRs, temporary workers earned about 11% less. And I can use my regression model to predict the wages that these workers receive. So for example, I could compare the average Mexican worker across the legal status groups. And to give you an idea, the average Mexican worker has about 7 years of education, has been to the US about 4 times before. He's proficient in English, and in this data set, he's working in a skilled job, so things like skilled construction or skilled manufacturing. So if an average worker was an LPR, he would earn about $10.34 per hour. And this is in the year 2000, that's the midpoint of my data. If he was an unauthorized worker, he would earn a little more than $9 an hour, and temporary workers would earn about $9.17 per hour. So as you can see, despite temporary workers' legal authorization to work in the country, their wages really do not differ from the wage levels of unauthorized workers, and both groups earned less than LPRs. So in that wage analysis, I considered all guest workers, but within this group, H-2A workers, or those in agriculture, have legal rights not given to H-2B workers. Employers are required to provide H-2A workers with housing at no cost to the worker. And so housing could act as a compensation benefit to H-2A workers since they do not have to pay for rent. So I wanted to take this into consideration, and I asked how do H-2A workers' monthly earnings and the compensation compare to the monthly earnings of unauthorized workers and LPRs. So again, I'm using the same data set, the Mexican Migration Project. I just limit it to the agricultural workers in the data set. And I considered a respondent's total monthly earnings. So that was his reported hourly wage times the average number of hours worked per week times 4. And then to capture the added compensation covered by H-2A employers for housing, I basically added $155 to the monthly earnings of H-2A workers who indicated that they did not spend anything on rent. So where is this $155 coming from? This is actually the median amount of rent spent by H-2A workers whose housing cost was not covered by their employer in my data set. And just to note, so I'm comparing H-2A's compensation, this monthly earnings plus 155, to unauthorized workers and LPR's monthly earnings because they do not receive this housing benefit. So I find that, again, unauthorized workers' monthly earnings were much lower than LPR's monthly earnings. They earned about 30% less than LPRs. And again, temporary authorization to work in the country did not really improve H-2A workers' economic outcomes. Their monthly earnings are close to those of unauthorized workers, And H-2A workers' monthly earnings are 22% lower than those of LPRs. However, when I compared H-2A workers' compensation, so again, that monthly earnings plus the housing benefit, to unauthorized workers and LPR's monthly earnings, I found that H-2A workers were compensated 16% more than unauthorized workers. So the housing covered by employers did increase H-2A workers' monthly earnings so that their compensation was above that of unauthorized workers. And H-2A workers' compensation is closer to the monthly earnings of LPRs than those of unauthorized workers. So we're seeing that this benefit does help H-2A workers economically. So overall, I find that temporary work authorization does not provide better economic outcomes for temporary workers. Temporary workers' wages and monthly earnings are similar to those of unauthorized workers. In both groups, wages and monthly earnings fall below those of LPRs. And these findings suggest that temporary workers' dependence on their employers for their legal presence in the country results in their low wage levels. So as previous studies have shown, both unauthorized workers and temporary workers are dependent on their employer for their presence in the country and often fear deportation if they report some kind of wage theft or abuse or exploitation. And so employers can rely on this fear to offer them the lowest possible wages. The only difference in the economic outcomes between unauthorized workers and H-2A workers is the housing allowance for H-2As. And so without this benefit, their economic outcomes are virtually identical. And then H-2B workers, who made up around 37% of H-2 visas in 2014, they are not entitled to this benefit. So with policymakers and employers pressuring the government to increase the number of temporary workers admitted into the U.S., it's imperative that we recognize that the work conditions commonly faced by temporary workers are not much better than those experienced by unauthorized workers. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Lauren. And now we have Tom Hertz. Tom is an economist in the Economic Research Service in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And he's been in the Rural Economy branch of the Resource and Rural Economics Division since 2009. He's also taught at American University and was a visiting scholar at the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. And I'll just let you get right into it. Clicker works too. Clicker.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks DPI for hosting. And I'd also like to make a shout out to Daniel Carroll, who is the man behind the NAWS survey, the National Agricultural Workers Survey, which is the source of every scrap of data that I will present today. So what I'm looking at is a couple of questions relating to the current policy context we're in. I'm sure you're all aware of the DAPA and DACA executive orders, which could grant administrative relief from deportation and grant work permits to about half of all currently unauthorized crop farm workers. That's the estimate, is that roughly half of the unauthorized farm workers would be DAPA or DACA eligible. And those unauthorized workers, in turn, make up about half of the overall hired crop farm workforce. So it's a non-trivial number of farm workers. And the questions that I want to ask are the extent to which legalization would alter wages, hours of work, total farm and non-farm earnings of the currently unauthorized, and also say what I can, which is not as much as I'd like to be able to say, about how legalization would affect the rate of transition out of agriculture. So it's no surprise that farm worker earnings are low, have been low. Numbers from fiscal 2012 for the average unauthorized crop farm worker in the NAWS survey were just around $9. and that was compared to about $9.70 if you were authorized immigrant or citizen. So there is a wage differential there. There's also an earnings gap because of the duration of employment. So average weeks for unauthorized were 39 in 2012. And that's considerably up from the decade of the 1990s when average weeks worked were only about 23. So the good news for earnings for farm workers, unauthorized included, has been an increase in full year employment, less old-fashioned seasonality, more year-round employment. So that's been a source of climbing earnings for some farm workers. But some of the disadvantages that crop farm workers face, of course, 80% are immigrant, and about half of all of them lack immigration legal status. So advocates have always understood that there's two basic approaches to addressing farm worker well-being. One is to try and raise wages and hours of work on the farm and improve working conditions, and the other is to facilitate the transition out of agriculture into more stable and better paid industries. So some of the interesting initiatives that have come up in the past, worth mentioning the Agricultural Labor Relations Act in California, where a huge number of hired crop farm workers are located, created a very supportive legal environment for union activity in California agriculture. Agriculture is exempted from the National Labor Relations Act, but California has an act modeled on it, which is quite strong. It generated a lot of litigation, but has not succeeded in unionizing the industry. In fact, unionization declined in the long run. And according to the NAWS survey, less than 1% of farm workers are represented by a contract, which seems quite low. United Farm Workers, the main union involved, has been more successful via legislation. They were a driving force behind the recent increase in the minimum wage from $8 to $9, and it's going up to 10 in 2016. Maybe with the current momentum, it'll go up a little further or a little faster, but that much is already set in stone. And then, of course, in '86, we had the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which authorized 2.7 million people, including 1.1 million via the Special Agricultural Worker Program. So it had a disproportionate impact in agriculture precisely because of growers' concerns about what would happen if their farm workers were legalized and left, or how would they survive if the new penalties that were imposed by IRCA made them unable to employ the remaining farm workers who were still unauthorized. So there was a special push to authorize agricultural workers. It was known that not all of the workers who were authorized through this program were in fact agricultural workers, and it was hoped that with more secure legal status, higher earnings would follow. As far as we can tell, in agriculture itself, IRCA seems to have had little effect on wages and employment. Yes, many people were authorized. I will argue that many of them did leave agriculture as a result. They were replaced by a continuing inflow of unauthorized workers, and it sort of was business as usual in agriculture. The enforcement at the workplace turned out to be much less fearsome than growers had feared. So those are two major policy initiatives that didn't really alter economic conditions in agriculture all that much. So I will ask whether IRCA allowed people to get out of agriculture, and I will point out that the question was debated but not resolved, and I'll present some estimates to suggest that it did accelerate the transition out of agriculture, which for many people is the plan. There are many people who work in agriculture for the rest of their lives and will tell you so, this is where I'm going to stay, but there's another chunk who are saying, I'm here for a few years and I'm trying to get a job in the broader economy. So the current policy environment, we have a slowdown in unauthorized immigration due to economic growth and demographic change in Mexico, as well as tougher enforcement both at the border and internally, I believe. There are some signs of tightening in farm labor markets, but you don't really see it in real wages yet. I mean, real wages are slowly climbing for farm workers, which is remarkable in itself, given that real wages aren't climbing for other workers with low education and other occupations. So farm workers are doing marginally better in wage terms, I think, than people at similar levels of education in the U.S. economy, but not that you could point to any national farm labor shortage or anything. Comprehensive immigration reform appears stalled, so DAPA-DACA is sort of the policy issue that seems most salient. And one of the things that's interesting about it is it's not a comprehensive reform. It's a single intervention. It is authorization of a number of people. It's not combined with a big guest worker program. It's not combined with any particular enforcement changes or E-Verify or anything like that. So in principle, it's an easier policy to understand what its implications would be than a whole package of policies like comprehensive reform might be. So the methods that I use are very similar to Lauren's. These are the outcomes that I look at. I analyze them by legal status using standard regression methods quite similar to hers. I don't have a slide listing all the control variables, but there's a lot of them. One difference between the way I go about it and the way she did was that I allow the effect to differ in certain ways. So I calculate a different effective legal status for each time period. The status effect has changed over time. And I also calculate a different legal status effect for each level of experience. So once you do that, you don't have a single answer to the question, what's the legal status premium? You have an answer that depends on who you are. And once you do that, the most natural way to calculate the answer is to say, what if we take the people who are currently unauthorized with their relatively low levels of experience and authorize them? The average effect of doing that will be smaller than the overall average, because the overall average would include the effect of authorizing a whole lot of people with higher levels of experience. So you get a smaller answer in my approach than you might in an overall average approach by allowing the effect to be different for different people and focusing on the group that you're concerned about, which just happen to be the group for whom the benefits of legalization are smaller because they have less experience. Okay, so that may be one reason why I come up with a much smaller green card measurement than you do for your agriculture-only subset. The other reason is there's no reason why two different surveys have to give the same answer, much as you'd like them to. All right, and another thing I don't do, and I don't think you do either, is correct for selection bias, unobservable differences by legal status. This is all the rage in the econometrics literature, and I'm trying to not go there, but I think I'll have to sooner or later. So for the second question, where I'm looking at the exit from agriculture, I just do a sort of a spreadsheet analysis where I look at the prima facie evidence of a decline in the number of IRCAs, I call them, IRCA authorized workers, okay? So after IRCA, a bunch of people were authorized. They're found in the agricultural survey, and then their numbers dwindle. Well, that could just be the normal attrition of a fixed cohort over time, or it could have been accelerated by legalization itself. Were they able to get out of agriculture faster? So that's the question that I answer, or try to answer, by comparing their employment trends to the people who are similar to them in terms of age and year of entry to the US, but remained unauthorized. And what's interesting is that there was so much fraud in the seasonal agricultural worker program, people who got authorized without ever having been farm workers or without proper documentation, because it was relatively easy to do. It was designed to be easy to do because the farmers were terrified about losing their workers, that there may not be all that much difference between somebody who did authorize and someone who didn't. It may not be that the ones who authorized had a huge amount more farm experience. It could be a fairly random thing. So that's my control group, and I'll get to those results in a minute. This here is the decline in employment of the IRCA authorized cohort that I study in the final section of my analysis. The purple section is the rise in the unauthorized employment. And you can see that since all of these people were previously unauthorized as well, if you sort of add them together, you can see that overall unauthorized employment, had the IRCA not legalized this group here, would still have risen. And the main reason for that is the decline in US-born employment, but which then rebounded somewhat, okay? So the unauthorized share in agriculture has been about 50% for the past decade or so. It doesn't seem to be changing all that much. These are the raw wage differentials, not adjusted for anything. Green card workers making about 10% more than the unauthorized, naturalized citizens making about 20% more than the unauthorized in the most recent time period that I focus on. When you apply the regression analysis, much of the difference in earnings between unauthorized, legalized permanent residents, and naturalized citizens can be explained away by their lower levels of education, their lower levels of experience. Those are the primary things right there. English language proficiency matters as well, but it's primarily experience that does the self-explanatory work. So you get these relatively modest wage gains of around 4% on average since in the second decade of the survey. That's for green card, which I would argue is the relevant number here, because if DAPA grants a work authorization, that's neither a green card nor citizenship, but it's probably closer to a green card than anything else in terms of its effect on your labor market options. So this is the similar graph for the naturalized. This is about 8% on average over this interval here. A bigger effect, as Larry pointed out. But both of them, notice, seem to be dropping in the last period. It's a little hard to draw much about the fluctuations. This is a 3-year average. Each one of these is a 3-year average. There seems to be a slight decline in the wage premium for green cards and for the naturalized in the most recent 3-year study, but it's hard to know if that's going to hold up or if it's just a statistical fact. So here are all the outcomes that I looked at. On top is as observed and below is adjusted. So here is the green card, roughly 10% differential, again for the second decade, before adjustment and after adjustment, goes down to 4%. For naturalized, it starts at 23 and goes down to about 8. And then I also looked at all these other things: days worked, total farm earnings, probability of also working off the farm, and an estimate of your total farm and non-farm earnings. And many of them differ in predictable ways before adjustment for covariating factors, but most of those differences go away for the green card category. They make a little bit more per hour. They don't work significantly more days. They actually seem to work a little bit, about 3% fewer days. Their overall earnings are basically identical. They don't seem to have better off-farm opportunities or to take advantage of better off-farm opportunities. And overall earnings are pretty similar. So what this suggests is that legal status does confer an hourly wage advantage, but not much else among people who remain in agriculture, and that's an important caveat. I only see these people if they stay on the farm, otherwise they exit the survey. I can't track them as they go into other industries, and that's the real way that legalization is supposed to raise your earnings. But one would like to know what it does in agriculture, and what we do see is that many more of these outcomes are positive even after adjusting for the covariates among the naturalized. The hourly wage differential is larger. Days worked, they seem to be working 22% more days, making 27% or 28% more overall. But they also work off the farm significantly less. So naturalized citizens who are working in agriculture are not transitioning to other things. They are settled in agriculture. They're not spending a whole lot of time working other jobs. They have full-year, full-time jobs in agriculture, and that's what they do. So there's it's not as if, well, I'll leave it at that. Okay, finally, I think I'm running a little short on time. Let me zip through this. This was my attrition analysis of the IRCA authorized cohort. The green area is the actual sort of smoothed number of workers that were observed. And the purple is my estimate of the additional losses that were due to legalization. That had legalization not occurred, the cohort would have declined at this rate instead of the faster rate that we observe. So after 5 years, which is about when the gap is the biggest, I'm saying that of the 47% that disappeared, 26% would have disappeared anyway, and 21% disappeared because they had legal status and that allowed them to move through to other industries. But 10 years later, there was no difference. So in other words, it looks like what legalization did was accelerate the exit of the people who plan to exit sooner or later anyway. That's the conclusion that I draw from this. And then after about 10 years, you're left with the people who don't plan to exit. And it's actually quite remarkable statistic, which I come up in the tail end of my paper. I believe the number is 80% who say that they intend to work in agriculture for the rest of their life, or as long as they are able to. Right, so when asked, how long do you expect to continue doing farm work in the USA, 80% of unauthorized workers in the most recent few years of the survey respond over 5 years or as long as I am able. So these are not people who are anticipating leaving agriculture. And it's important to remember that the workforce is really a mix of people who are very committed to agriculture. It's their best earnings opportunity. It's what they do, and people who are passing through on the way to better employment in other sectors. So, final conclusions. The wage effect appears fairly modest of legalization. Does not appear to be an effect on hours or earnings. These estimates are lower than some other published results that are on the order of 10 or 20%. I've already explained that I think that part of the reason might be the treatment on the untreated approach that I take, which is less than the sort of overall effect. But other people have done that and still gotten bigger numbers than I, using the same data. And the difference there is probably the econometrics of selection bias. And real quickly, if the unauthorized exert greater effort, and we can't see that, and we assume that they would still exert greater effort if they were authorized, then that might explain why I'm getting a smaller number than people who are able to control in magical econometric ways for this unobservable effort. Now, it's quite plausible that the unauthorized do exert greater effort, because if they don't and they get fired, the consequences of losing that job are much more dire. But then the question becomes, well, if they were authorized, would they still work as hard? Or would that security enable them to relax just a little bit? In which case, it may not be appropriate to continue to control for those unobservable factors. The unobservables themselves may be endogenous in the language of my profession. So I'm going to argue that my results are plausible and that some of the other estimates may be inflated by correcting for selection bias in inappropriate ways. But that remains a topic for future research that I won't belabor. Okay, real quickly, the exit rate calculations provide a rough guide to how farm labor supply might respond to DAPA-DACA or a similar legalization. For example, if half the current workforce is currently unauthorized and half of them become authorized, and that has a 21% effect on their proclivity to be in agriculture after 5 years, that would be half of 21% would be a 5% decline in the overall farm labor supply, which does not seem like a very large number, but it's important to point out that in some crops in some regions, the number unauthorized is much higher. Certain growers, 3/4 or more of their workers are unauthorized. If those people are all DAPA-DACA eligible, they could face more impact on their labor supply. And finally, perhaps the most important outcome of all is the actual outcomes, whether it's the cost to the farmers or the benefit to farm workers, depend crucially on the future strength of the non-farm economy. I mean, all of this is historical data, and it all depends on the economic conditions. What actually happens whenever we legalize whatever we do actually depends on most strongly on the non-farm economy's conditions, what your other employment alternatives are. All right, thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. And finally, we have Charles Kamasaki, who is with the National Council of La Raza, which is the nation's largest civil rights and advocacy organization. He's also a fellow with the Migration Policy Institute. And he's writing a book on the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which I'm dying to read, which Tom talked about. I have asked Charles to contextualize what these findings mean in terms of the broader debate about immigration reform and legalization.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks to EPI and Larry. There's actually, people don't know it, but there's kind of like a slant to this because of the wire, so you keep wanting to go back. Anyway, sorry. But thanks to EPI, Larry and Ross and Daniel for not just this invitation, but for the incredibly important work they do every day. I do need to start with a caveat. So unlike Lauren or Tom, I don't either have a PowerPoint or, for that matter, much new research or technical knowledge to share with you, but I hope I can provide both a little bit of a historical and policy context. So first, Lauren and Tom were not just really substantive, but unusually clear about presenting rigorous findings from both the MMP and the NAWS databases, notwithstanding their limitations. And their findings really aren't at all surprising, right? That the fact that temporary workers are either worse off considerably or certainly no better off than unauthorized workers is something that we've known for a long time. And I would argue, in fact, they are both economically and in other ways far worse off, in part because neither temporary workers nor unauthorized workers have access to safety net and other supports available to other low-income workers, inadequate as they may be, earned income tax credit, child tax credit, and so forth. And secondly, this doesn't take into account the non-economic exploitation that unauthorized workers and, in fact, we believe many temporary workers will also face. The fact that the industries in which they are concentrated tend to have the highest rates of accidents and death on the job. And this is true for at least three reasons, and let me go from just to be contrarian, going from the specific to the general. First, that whether you're talking about H-2 temporary workers or the unauthorized, the populations themselves face considerable constraints in exercising their rights and protections under the law. It's not just, although it is true that some may fear and may be deterred from complaining due to fear of deportation or other forms of retribution, it is also true that they lack really the adequate access to information networks and other sources of assistance to effectively assert their rights. I'll talk about the abysmally low enforcement budgets for OSHA and the Wage and Hour Division and state wage and hour divisions in a second. But I will just note that the system places very heavy burdens on individuals to assert their rights. You've got to know who to contact. You probably have to have help in filing a complaint. And the nonprofit or free or limited cost legal services available to support these groups, unauthorized or temporary workers, is really very, very limited. So you have a individualized environment that is very difficult for temporary workers or unauthorized to assert their rights, but that is reinforced by a profoundly difficult policy structure at the nexus between labor law enforcement and immigration law enforcement. And just to give you one statistic to underscore that, nationally, according to a recent report by MPI, we are spending about $18 billion a year for immigration law enforcement. That is essentially to try and address a population of about 11 million unauthorized and to prevent that population from growing. To try and enforce labor rights and standards for well over 100 million full-time workers that are fully covered by the law, perhaps 8 or 9 million employers, the nation spends just over $1 billion for all labor law enforcement. That's at the federal level. I think it's about 1,000 inspectors and maybe a similar number at the local level. So we got 2,000 inspectors to try and enforce the rights of more than 100 million people at 8 million or 9 million work sites. It is true that, as Lauren has pointed out, that temporary workers cannot move among employers. The movement of unauthorized is not maybe quite as constrained, but similarly constrained because of the lack of work authorization. But what's important is even the upward mobility, even limited upward mobility within, say, agricultural sectors, from laborer to foreman, from foreman to crew chief or troquero in the vernacular, to eventually maybe running your own crews or running multiple crews. Those are all essentially denied to temporary workers and severely constrained for unauthorized workers. And then for every worker in this sector, you also have the problem of the Fair Labor Standards Act exemption for all agricultural workers. So you have a really difficult policy infrastructure to try and enforce what limited rights farm workers already have, regardless of immigration status. And finally, one might ask, why does this exist? And I don't think I have to tell this audience a lot about it, but it really is representative of in effect, political economy underlying this policy system that is really rigged against the worker from the very beginning. We have a 100-year history in this country, roots going back literally to World War I, and the following Bracero programs, 4 repatriation campaigns that included more than 1 million U.S. citizens deported back to Mexico in the 30s and the 1950s, all based on trying to preserve a very unique system of employment that essentially treats workers as commodities in the context of agriculture. That is, when they're needed, we want as many of them as possible, and when they're not needed, because they are not, by and large, granted permanent immigration status, they are simply expected to return. So what was in the 1970s, it was very famous in the immigration literature, there was a so-called iron triangle that consisted of agribusiness, a friendly Congress, particularly in the grower-friendly Senate, and the INS, at the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which wasn't so much lax in enforcement on a consistent basis, but just worked very closely with the agricultural community with respect to when and how it exercised its discretion in enforcement. One may think that is a relic of the last century, but in fact it is not. Literally every year, every time harvest season comes about, you will see a whole host of bipartisan groups of senators and representatives writing to ICE or CBP, the enforcement arms of the Department of Homeland Security, calling on them, asking them, urging, demanding, threatening them that they should be exercising their discretion in not enforcing immigration laws during harvest season, so as not to endanger the underlying importance of needing to harvest the crops. So I would argue this is not just a historical relic, but it is some form of iron triangle still in existence today. There is also, in fact, I think, a concern about race, which I won't go into in detail, but I don't believe it is especially accidental. That at the time when agricultural workers were largely exempted from labor laws, the itinerant labor force in agriculture was largely African American. Now it is largely Latino, and it is not surprising, at least to me, that it is one of those factors that works synergistically to ensure that in good times and in bad times, agricultural workers, regardless of status, are heavily disadvantaged in the labor market. So given this big problem, what do we do about it? And I would argue, because it is complex, multi-layered, with powerful economic, policy, and political barriers, we need to move on all 3 of those fronts. That is to say, on the economic side, we should be trying to use our consumer market power to push for better corporate practices, as the Immokalee Workers Project has done, or the Equitable Food Initiative that Farm Worker Justice is a big player in, trying to force the large retail industries susceptible to consumer pressure to impose better standards on their growers. On the policy and litigation side, as so many people in the room already do, we obviously need to use all of the tools at our disposal to ensure maximum protections in temporary worker programs, deploying nonprofit assistance as one strategy to enforce standards, nonprofit legal assistance, and obviously working towards comprehensive immigration reform that would both reduce the size of the inherently exploitable unauthorized population, as well as strengthen reforms in temporary worker programs. And finally, I think as part of an effort to politically push for a rising tide for all workers that hopefully will lift the boats even in agriculture, we at NCLR believe in working closely with people like EPI, to try and improve the condition of all workers in this country. So, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Testing 1, 2. So thanks, everyone. I think that was very interesting. And we don't have a ton of time, so I'll maybe ask one question to get us started. But if everyone in the crowd could start thinking up their questions, and we'll call on you. One of the things that wasn't talked about is in agriculture, the H-2A adverse effect wage rate. This is essentially a prevailing wage rule that sets what H-2A agricultural guest workers will be paid. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts, but specifically maybe Tom, can you say something just about how that works, how it's set, and what sort of impact you think it has in agricultural wages? I mean, maybe that's what's keeping H-2A wages in Lauren's data set as high as they are. Maybe they'd be lower, or would they be higher or lower? What do you
Okay, I'd be happy to take a stab at that. I should have said right from the very start, of course, that I'm speaking my own opinions. I work for the U.S. government, but I'm not speaking for the USDA or the Economic Research Service. So with that reinforced proviso, let me take a stab at your question. So the adverse effect wage rates are determined by the wage in each region from a survey in the previous year. Department of Labor publishes them and says, okay, if you're going to hire an H-2A worker, this is the wage you got to pay. It's supposed to be the average for that region so that it sort of keeps things from undercutting that average. They are often, they're on the order of $10, $11, $12 an hour, depending on the region. They may be higher than wages paid to unauthorized workers, and that can be a source of unhappiness among growers with the H-2A program. But the housing costs are actually probably the bigger cost item, and the bureaucratic difficulties of working within the H-2A framework are legendary. So, in fact, the wage rates are probably not the real source of trouble. And one of the things that's interesting is one of the best pieces of evidence that the farm labor market is tightening right now is that despite all the complexities and difficulties of working with the H-2A program, growers have doubled their interest in it over the past few years. It's gone from about 50,000 certified requests for H-2A workers to about 100,000. So that's proof that wages are tightening and they're being driven into this program that they're not generally very happy with.
Can you maybe say one follow-up word on those employer complaints about the burdensomeness of the program? Because I actually think my own opinion is that it's a bit controversial. Because if you look at the Labor Department certification data, I mean, everything is processed timely at 99% of the applications are processed timely. We don't have the DHS data, but if you look at the State Department data, it's about 90-something% of the visas are actually issued that get to them from DHS. So
it is a controversial
I question
issue.
whether that actually means, whether burdensome means we don't like to pay for stuff and we don't like to have to file forms and pay an immigration attorney. Is it really burdensome, or is it burdensome because we have to do something?
I've thought about this question a lot, and my personal opinion is that the way the program is administered, it's not just the wage rate, it's not just the housing cost, though those are important. But the actual process is truly part of the problem. That's my personal opinion.
Anybody else have any thoughts on H-2A or wage rates?
No, but I bet Adrian has a rebuttal back there.
Oh, she saw me. Okay.
Please, could you please state your name and your affiliation, please?
Brian Pasternak. I'm the Director of Operations at the U.S. Department of Labor. We administer the Guestworker programs. Like Tom, I'm here representing myself, not the official position of the department on anything, but I will make a comment. I appreciated Charles's observation about the Iron Triangle and the notion that the concerns about particularly agriculture program doesn't really lend itself well to a Republican or a Democratic platform. We see it happen both ways. Certainly in wages, they are a lot higher. This was the first year we published wages that in agriculture there were no less than $10 an hour. In the Dakotas, they've been increasing actually a lot faster because of the oil and gas being there. They've been increasing fairly rapidly. They're at almost $14 an hour, and we get lots of complaints from members of Congress and growers about the average cost to actually pay. My question for the panel would be, there's been a lot of good evidence here, and I appreciate EPI putting this on. It's been very informative for me. The sort of discussion political on the Hill, we're talking about, an A word average spec wage rate that's actually fairly livable, at least $10 an hour. The Senate bill that's been passed is certainly going to, from what I read, reduce worker wages by almost $2 per hour, create a very large guest worker ag program on the tune of $500,000 to the growers coming in. There is some reduction of what you would consider to be, we consider to be core benefits to workers. And I'm just sort of curious about what people think might be on the horizon there, because that seems to have been a compromise solution from the Senate, at least, that is supportive of this administration in relation to some of the research evidence that's been presented here about the impact that could have on wages and working conditions of domestic and H-2A guest workers in agriculture.
Did you want to, are you deferred or are you okay? I don't know if anyone has any comments on that.
Well, I would just say, as an organization that did support, with some reluctance, the Senate bill, like any bill, there are numerous compromises involved in the legislative process.
Correct. That's a very diplomatic answer.
I think that's correct. In terms of the Senate bill, I think that was definitely a very difficult process in terms of reaching agreement between various groups that are pressing that specific piece. And I know the wage piece was certainly a very difficult piece to reach as well. And certainly, we did support that compromise, and we did it fully acknowledging that there were some concessions that farm workers had to make to reach an agreement that did provide agricultural, current agricultural workers with paths that that compromise. In terms of the burdensomeness of the H-2A program, I just want to kind of remind the audience here, for those who may not be as familiar with the program, that the structure of the program is really intended to protect U.S. workers and protect their wages and working conditions. And while there is no cap at all on the H-2A program, that is one reason why there are these various protections in the H-2A program, which are quite modest, but still important. And they are really intended to encourage employers to hire U.S. workers if they are available, rather than to resort to the H-2A program as a very, relatively easy source of labor, relatively unlimited source of labor. Just in terms of the wages that you guys have been discussing, there are two factors that I wondered whether these play into it at all. One is related to the temporary workers and the recruitment fees, which, while legal in the H-2A program, are rampant. And I wondered whether that was considered at all in the calculation of wages. And then with respect to the U.S. workers, where we do have the majority, at least half, possibly large numbers of undocumented workers, was there any attempt to determine how that impacts the U.S. worker wages? When we're looking at a permeation of the workforce by undocumented workers who lack bargaining power, that may in part explain some of the U.S. worker wages not being quite as much of a differential as we would expect to see once you bring in the various factors.
Well, I can address your question about the recruitment fees. So unfortunately, MMP doesn't ask any question about recruitment fees or costs to move to the U.S. I know other studies have shown that temporary workers often go into debt to get into the U.S. So unfortunately, the wage rate really just covers, and the monthly earnings cover hourly wages and the number of hours worked.
Could I?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I
Go
know
ahead,
you had
please.
something to add. Well, I would just add, and this was mentioned in Lauren's paper, and one needs to be, I know I'm treading dangerously into substance here, but some of these purported benefits come with downsides as well. So indeed, housing is a potentially significant benefit. But in the hands of some employers, that turns into essentially a closed system of isolating the workers. Often, I mean, this again goes back to previous centuries where, they're they're charged for groceries and other kinds of services or products, not unlike the old sort of script systems in the copper mine. So yeah, there's no question that not having to pay rent is an economic benefit, but being gouged on your food every week may diminish that benefit.
And just to follow up on what Charles said, one thing I also mentioned in the paper is, with the employer providing housing, it can, in a sense, again, isolate workers and kind of increase their dependence on the employer. So that just kind of adds to the power dynamic in the relationship. It might make it that much harder for, individuals trying to assert their claims.
On the issue of, one more thing on the H-2A program. So the current H-2A program is unlimited, and there are almost no H-2A workers in California, where there are 300,000 farm workers. It's easier to hire unauthorized. So it has been estimated by other people, not me, Phil Martin out at UC Davis, that the Senate bill temporary worker program would be a temporary program that would suit California growers, and it would become the effective labor supply for California. So there must be some difference between the way that, the difference between the way that program is structured and the way the current program is structured, according to him, was dispositive, that it would make enough of a difference that it would go from a program that isn't used to a program that is used. So that sort of bounds the cost of the two programs a little bit, gives you an understanding of how those would shake out. And as for the effect on U.S. workers, the kind of analysis that I run looks at the current labor market in its current equilibrium, where we have who we have, and looks at the gaps between them, to do a more sophisticated analysis of how all these wages would circulate in a new equilibrium where a group was authorized, temporary workers were brought in. That's a bigger question. So it's a very important caveat to say that studying current differences between different types of workers, even with all these regression methods, isn't really predicting the future of what will happen to a complicated, interconnected series of markets if a policy actually passes. So the cross-sectional results tell you what they tell you, but they're sort of a first cut at what, in truth, is a much more complicated economic question.
Tom, this is Ross Eisenberg from EPI. Just if you're an employer and the current program says you have to pay the A work, and now the new program says you get to pay an A work that is arbitrarily $1 or $2 less, that alone would be reason for you to support the new program. The new program also doesn't have the housing guarantee. So, I mean, those parameters, I think, are more than explanatory, beyond any, paper.
No, the cost, the actual upfront costs are lower. That's true. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I keep going back and forth. So I have.
Could you state your name?
I'm Mark Rosenblum from Migration Policy Institute. So I had one question for Lauren, and then I'm trying to think of how to weigh in on this. The incentives for employers to use H-2A and H-2B or not. But so my question for Lauren is, if I understand your findings correctly, when you looked at temporary workers overall, you found no wage difference between temporary workers and unauthorized workers. Then when you look just at H-2As, comparing them to ag workers, you see that there is a benefit, mostly in the form of the housing subsidy. So the question is, did you look at non-ag temporary workers, H-2Bs, and compare them to unauthorized workers in their industries, just to sort of, because that was the exercise you did with the ag workers, and I'm wondering if you did that same industry-specific analysis with the non-ag workers to look for a benefit.
I did not look at just the H-2Bs. I think that would be a really interesting analysis that I could definitely add to the paper. Yeah.
And obviously, sort of one reason it matters, to go to this conversation about, whether employers would use the new, the S-744 Guestworker program, and one way to think about this is, what are the incentives for employers to use a temporary worker program or not? And from Lauren's findings, if employers aren't paying any extra for a guest worker versus an unauthorized worker, you would expect employers to use the guest workers, because that's legal, and if there were any disincentive to using hiring an unauthorized worker, then you would prefer to hire a law worker if it's not going to cost you anymore. So either there are some hidden costs in there, the processing costs, or there's some wage that Lauren's not picking up, or, and this may also be true, we're doing nothing to hold employers accountable for hiring unauthorized workers. But, in terms of policy interventions, we can obviously doing more effective worksite enforcement can cause employers to use a program that they don't like because because wages are higher or it's burdensome. In the absence of that, it's very difficult to get employers to opt into these programs. But Lauren's findings that there's no cost difference between unauthorized and temporary workers, and yet employers still don't use them, tells us something about what the incentives are for employers.
Yeah, I'll just say, I mean, you guys can answer, but I'll just say, if you look at the H-2B occupations, you can go back 10, 12 years, wages have been completely flat or even declining in the top 20 occupations or so, and the unemployment rates are sky high. I mean, double digits in almost every occupation. So it's not like there's some big national labor shortage. Maybe there's some localized ones, but there isn't a big national one. But they are liking to use the H-2B program. So that's sort of the other, another wrinkle in it. But
and they like to use the H-2B program, which Lauren's data suggests is less expensive compared to unauthorized workers, and they don't take advantage of the H-2A program, which is uncapped, because it's more expensive and/or more burdensome.
your thoughts?
And the H-2B program is capped.
Right.
Yeah,
and
right.
And you have also, if, in equilibrium, those wages could be the same, but that doesn't mean that if you removed one group or the other, they could just fill that hole with the other group, right? I mean, it may be that there's no wage difference between them, but it doesn't prove that they feel the same about both groups of workers, if you see what I'm saying.
So a couple things. Charles, Flavia Jimenez from the Advancement Project. First of all, thank you, Charles, for bringing up the issue of race. I think that in terms of wage gaps generally, looking at racial disparities, and particularly looking at the history of farm work going all the way back, right, is a really important thing for us to take a look at. But also, just the question about state laws, and when we look at policies specifically that may target enforcement on individuals, there are certain states that have certainly moved up or put more pressure on workers because of the inability of the federal government and this nation's inability to move forward on comprehensive immigration reform. I wonder if there are any studies that have looked at sort of a regional or state-by-state factors of state laws that may enforce immigration more heavily than other regions or areas in the United States, and what that data might tell us about policies at the state level that are pushing wages even lower for folks in the Southeast region.
That would be Lauren's answer.
I actually don't know of any studies that have done this yet, but I actually am moving that way for my dissertation. So, so I'm glad that you're interested in that topic, and check back in a year or so. Hopefully, I'll have
Well,
some.
couldn't you look at the Mexican Migration Project data and pick out the states where, there have been enforcement actions? Same with the NAS.
I think with the MMP data, there's not quite enough state-by-state variation for me to do that. But I'm hoping to use ACS or CPS and impute legal status and then look at cross-state differences. So.
Please.
I'm Stuart Brown with Warren Capital. I have a question that you sort of touched on, but not really. And I'm just wondering, this business of sealing the border, which has not been an issue earlier on, where you had migrants coming across and they would work seasonally and then they would go back, and it wasn't so difficult or so intimidating to go back and forth. And I'm wondering if there is an effect on wages based on the intimidation of sealing the border, or what effect does sealing the border have on wages?
And I think the main effect of sealing the border has been to make the unauthorized population a longer-term population than it's been. I think 10 years ago it was about a third. We're here longer than 10 years now. It's more like 2/3. But I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I don't.
Yeah.
I think that.
Any other questions? Well, I'll ask. Have any of you thought about?
I mean, I guess one thought on that. In the last decade or so, maybe slightly less, and if one wants to go back to the IRA in 1996, there has been a discernible change, and I think the studies you're referring to are from Doug Massey and many of his colleagues. One of the things that's going to be interesting, at least for me, to think about, and I certainly don't know of any studies here, is it has changed something very significantly, which is for agriculture, this assumption that you had an inexhaustible supply of unauthorized as a sort of fallback. That may well be changing. And that may well, in fact, represent a greater willingness to go through the bureaucratic hassle of, utilizing temporary worker programs. But, that's just a wild guess.
The border security or enforcement in general was cited by, I think, Pew Hispanic Trust, and they're trying to understand why net migration from Mexico had slowed down or maybe even reversed. I think it has reduced inflows. So if it has reduced inflows, it will tend to raise the wages of the people who the inflowers are competing with, which is generally the previous generation of inflow, the previous year's inflows, who are the most similar worker characteristics. So a reduction in migration from Mexico and South and Central America should tighten the labor markets and raise wages for the people who are most directly in competition with those workers who are no longer coming in.
I'll ask.
I have one more question. And when you were, Lauren was first presenting the data, 2/3 of the people were not documented. 1/3 were actually registered temporary employment. And I'm wondering why that is, and is it because of the difficulty of the employee to fill the paperwork, or is it the employer doesn't want to fill in the paperwork? Is there a limit to how many people can sign up? And what effect that 2/3, 1/3 roughly has on wages? I mean, I see that there's a difference in the waging. I understand that, but the fact that it's so overwhelmingly the undocumented people who are getting the work.
So as to the differences in who would apply for temporary worker versus come as an unauthorized worker, I don't know of any studies that have really examined as to what kind of path, is chosen. When people have interviewed temporary workers, they say that they try to obtain a temporary visa because it offers kind of some sort of stability to them. And then in my data, you can also see that unauthorized workers have a lot more social capital in terms of like connections to people who have come to the U.S. before. So they have kind of a familiarity with the U.S. that maybe temporary workers don't always have. So I can see that from my data. And then can you repeat the second part of your question? It was how does having...
I'm left curious how that skews the information that you're collecting, because it's so overwhelmingly reflecting people who are not filling in the paperwork that are coming anyway.
So in terms of the number in my data,
Yeah.
okay, I see what you're saying. So although my temporary worker population is is smaller, the difference is there's no reason to suggest that this temporary worker population is maybe not a representative sample of the average temporary worker population, because
None of them are going to California.
so fewer are going to California because the employers in California aren't using temporary workers, but employers in other regions of the countries are. So you're getting an overall average comparison across regions. I do control for border state. If you're in a border state, and try to make those comparisons for the few that I do have in border state regions. Does that make sense?
Okay, so we've reached the end of our time. So I'm just going to ask everybody on the panel if they can give one quick policy recommendation to raise wages among these populations, and you don't have to answer if you can't. But I'd also like, if you have any thoughts on the use of shortage occupation lists. This is something that other countries do, especially for labor migration, where you study to see, you look at wages, turnover rates, to see which occupations in the country are actually having a labor shortage. And if there's a labor shortage, then you would give employers streamlined access to, say, an H-2B worker. And then I think it would be smart to put them on a sort of provisional path to legal permanent residence if they wanted. I think that's from the EPI perspective, sort of the smarter way to go. And I mean, the UK does this, Germany does, other countries do this, but get a lot of pushback from the business community that the government isn't as smart as the governments of the UK and Germany and Canada. So if you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to hear them, or any other policy recommendations to raise wages for the unauthorized and guest workers, especially considering the fact that there probably isn't political support for a legalization between now and 2024 or so. You can go first. And
Just work our way down.
yeah.
So to me, and maybe because I'm more of an academic than in policy, but to me, one of the roots of the problem with the temporary worker program is that the workers are tied to their employer. I think that the dependence on their employer really limits them. So I would try to reform the program, at least in a way to where temporary workers have more mobility while they are here in the U.S., along with increased regulation and increased oversight, just to make sure that they are receiving the rights that they're entitled to.
Thanks.
Because I work for the Department of Agriculture for the U.S. government, of course, I'm not allowed to comment on policy recommendations, but I can say that in the absence of any policy change, there seems to be a consensus that the status quo is one in which, in the future, farm labor markets will tighten. They already are tightening. The demographic trends in Mexico are such that it's probably, there's a thesis out there. Ed Taylor and his collaborators out in Davis are arguing that the era of labor abundance is maybe over, and employers have already responded the way they always do, which is they've mechanized to the extent possible. They've pushed the frontiers of mechanization and of mechanical assists, which are not full mechanization, but which can increase productivity and allow older workers to do the jobs that used to be more physically strenuous. So there's all kinds of tinkering around the edges of the way the agricultural production process works to save on labor, and it's already underway and it's likely to continue.
Has the ERS ever played around with shortage occupation lists? Separate question. Or shortage analyses?
I don't know. That's a good question. I do know that in the very early days.
You're talking about farm labor markets tightening, but
Yeah,
it seems
yeah.
like it would be a place that's ripe to.
Well, I've written a paper where I looked at certain counties and certain industries where there seemed to be both a fall in employment and a spike in wages, which is what you would expect if it was the labor supply problem. And you can spot, farm labor contractors in this particular county saw their wages go up by a lot. Maybe something's going on there. So there's some evidence, very crude evidence, for localized shortages here and there. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence for it. In terms of trying to quantify it and build we don't have anything in place. They used to do that in the earliest days of the Farm Labor Survey, the NAS Farm Labor Survey, which used to be called something else, the Q something or other. It goes back to the 30s. They would publish an estimate of growers' needs for labor and available supply. How they did it, I don't know, but maybe it's time to dust off some of those older methods.
And finally, Charles, the last word.
Well, as I concluded my presentation, I don't believe issues like this are particularly amenable to single solutions. So I'll just repeat, I do believe we need comprehensive immigration reform, and I think you would see the results not dissimilar from the previous experience from ERCA, which is some people leaving agriculture and those who remain earning some wage premium. I do like the notion of portability within temporary worker programs. As Lauren just suggested, the problem is once you start introducing those kinds of measures in the temporary workers programs, you lose the business support. So I am not convinced that that's actually any more doable, or a shortage occupation list, or a Ray Marshall-like immigration commission. All of those things, I am not at all convinced are any easier to pass and to enforce and to sustain than comprehensive immigration reform.
Okay, food for thought. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it.